This presentation intended to be quick introduction to icon design, but at the same time, I think it has enough for anyone to take on icons, like at least to get started on the whole subject. I'm going to start with a conventional definition about icons, and it's icons are a visual representation of an object, action, or idea. Some history, icons are very old because pictorial pictograms or pictorial representations are very, very old. So here's an example of some paintings from a cave in Bulgaria from 30,000 before Christ. And as you can see, these icons works very well. You can easily tell what's going on there and what they mean. And also some Egyptian iconography. Icons has been around like forever. It's basically a way to communicate ideas without words. And it can transcend cultures because of the same reason. You're not using a written verbal language. So it's about images. And those tend to be easily recognized by anyone. In modern age, we have other examples of icons, like the Olympic Games are good examples. They always have these pictograms to symbolize each discipline. And this is from the 70s, US Department of Transportation, a poster with some pictograms, a famous poster from Paul Rand, which is IBM. This is like very famous in the history of graphic design because it's a good example on how to communicate ideas and words without using words. Some examples of some brands that we know that use icons. And logo design is a different rabbit hole, but still it's a good example of how to use icons to represent ideas. Apple is a good example. Shell is a good example. Target, LG. And then if we jump to the point of history where the first UIs were born, we can see how like the Commodore 64 was in terms of icons, so iconography in the UI. Then the first Apple OS, Mac OS, the 7.5, Mac OS, the 10, more contemporary, some window versions. As you can see, there are some different trends. It really depends on the time in history. Windows XP went down this path where everything was kind of 3D skeuomorphism, like Apple did, starting with macOS 10, but then Microsoft in 2013 they came up with Metro, which was some sort of a design system, a design language, and they use these flat icons that are very schematic and nothing, like no shadows, no 3D, no nothing. And just going to the nitty gritty, these are the rules and tips that I consider to be like the fundamental principles for designing any icons. And the first one is position icons on pixel. And that means that icons need to be on grid and no decimals for the positions. Then if everything is on grid, then icons will look sharp no matter what. If you're implementing them in the right way, you're using in the size that we're designed to work on. And a quick tip is to use a regular monitor. I have full HD monitors and I go 100%, and then you can see very easily if something is not sharp. Then the next tip would be use adequate space. If we use like a dense padding around the icon, we make sure that icons can work as buttons if we need actions. And also the legibility is better because we always have this extra spacing when we place the icon within a layout. And this is just an example where we have like main container of 24 dp or pixels. And then the maximum height, width and height of an icon is 16 pixels. So that's kind of the constraints for building the icon. And then you have a main container that gives it the extra padding. Then the next one is keep it simple. So don't try to be like overlay like complex and use organic shapes. Just do it simple and very geometric. So it's much easier to understand at first glance. Mind cultural differences. Always use symbols, ideas that are commonly represented by the same thing all over the world. Like for this is a good example because mailboxes, in some places we don't have mailboxes, for example, and in others mailboxes are different than the common US mailbox or from the UK or other places. But an envelope, it's common in every culture. So that would be a fundamental rule. If we follow that, then we minimize the way that icons are understand by different cultures. Because one thing that is true is that we don't have like a world organization that is in charge of coming up with the standards and conventions around what an icon means. So, and these conventions happens organically, and it's hard to track them. It's hard to come up with a set of conventions that work all over the world. But if we focus on these ideas that are kind of common between cultures, then we minimize that lack of rules, of standards around the meaning of icons. These are like the main two approaches that you could take when designing an icon. You could use an outlined version or filled version. And there's nothing in between really. Either they are solid or linear. And that's good because it's a simple rule that we can always remember when designing icons. Then the next one is follow a chosen style. And here's an example of like, as you can see in this one, there are icons that have some sort of a perspective and others are flat, like this one. But this one is flat and this one has a perspective. And this one has a perspective and this one is flat. And in this other example, all of them are flat. So if you go with no perspective, then none of the icons should have perspective. And if you go with a little bit of perspective, which is not very recommended because it's more easy to understand, the lesser information, the better. But if it happens that you are building a design, an icon system that it has a little bit of perspective, then you should stick to that rule for every icon that you design. Then the next one is design icons for each size, because once you start scaling down or up the icons, they change the way they are perceived. And I'm going to show you that in Figma later. But as you can see, the first icon is much more simple. It has only 3 lines. The handle is smaller. And then as you go bigger, you have more room to work on the details and it's less abstract. The 48 pixel version is a good example because it has 1 extra line and then the handle, it feels more natural. It feels like you actually can grab the icon because the extra real estate gives you the opportunity to make the icon a little bit less abstract and more similar to what that object in real life is. And this is a good rule. Use the 5-second rule, which means that if you can't understand what the icon is about, what's the meaning of that icon, what that icon is representing in under 5 seconds, then the icon is not working. And the last tip or rule, is that icons improve the look and feel of your product. So, and here's just a random example from Airbnb. They have really good icons, and without these icons, the product wouldn't be the same. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that you have to use icons everywhere. When it makes sense to use icons, for example, because you want to reinforce an idea, or you need actions, you need icons in an up bar or in the top bar or navigation pattern that you're using, then try to make those icons as good as possible from the technical side and also in the way they look, because it's gonna make a big difference in your product. And here are some recommended icon libraries. The first one is the one from Google Material. It's a very good library. It can feel a little bit dull sometimes because icons are very generic, let's say, that there's not too much personality to them, which is a good thing depending on the use of that library, how you can apply those icons. They're different styles and they have comprehensive documentation, so you could actually design icons fairly easy based on their guidelines in case they don't have an icon that you need, and they are ready to use, so you can actually use them. Actually, they have a Google font now that is the all of the icons. But Nucleo, this is unbiased because I've been using this like forever. I think it's a great library. And even if you don't want to go with the icons that they have, they are so good in the technical sense that you could use them as a starting point and just grab those icons and tweak them. And it's much better than starting from scratch, especially if you don't have like the budget or time. Then we have the Noun project, which is not an icon system, but it's a very big library with many icons. I wouldn't recommend this for anyone looking for a collection of icons to use out of the box, but it's really good to get inspired when you need to build custom icons and also to analyze what are the conventions that are being organically established across the world, because there are many users and there are literally millions of icons in the Noun project. And then we have Font Awesome. Icons are not very good. They're not pixel perfect. They don't sit on the grid. There are a lot of inconsistencies, but on the other hand, at first glance, they look pretty similar between them, and they're easy to use and implement. And they're always updating the library and adding new icons, and you can find anything you need here. You have different styles. They have fonts. So it is a good, quick solution for icons. And they don't look too bad. I can recommend these, but it's not the first option that I would go with. And I think that's pretty much it. Then I have a list of references. When I shared this presentation, anyone can go and look into details in the sources that I used to extract some of this information. And let me know if you have any questions.
What software do you use to make icons from scratch?
Yeah, I'm using Figma now. I used to use Illustrator because it was the tool that was around back then, like 10 years ago or 6 years ago. And then I started using Figma because it's much easier to work like with pixels.
When do you suggest building an icon from scratch versus pulling one from a library?
I would say when we need to communicate a specific idea and you can't find any icon in that library that resembles to that idea, or the one that could be a fit, it's already associated with another idea. In short, if you don't find a good concept that is already in that library, you need to create a new one that looks like it belongs to the library.
Gotcha. So like all of these icons have different height and width, but they're all kind of within the box of like the icon frame. Mm-hmm. So they don't look too crazy, like out of proportion, even though they're all different sizes. What are your like guidelines or rules on how tall or how wide an individual icon can be, or how small it can be?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My approach is that I basically zoom out. I go 100% and I squint my eyes and I try to feel the visual weight of them and I try to balance them based on that. But that's kind of the intuitive approach. But if you want to go like more technical about it, then this is kind of the approach. You need to, it's not like the layout grid that you use to build the icons, because that's the pixel grid, but it's, I think the materials calling it basic shapes. So inside of the grid, you could have these sort of wireframes that gives you like the basic shapes. So let's say that you need a phone and a TV. Then you go with the tallest rectangle that you can fit there, and you go with the widest rectangle that you can fit there for the TV. And here's a good example from material. There's a clipboard and a camera. And the basic shapes are pretty much the same, but the details are different. And they go with that, with the biggest horizontal rectangle for the camera and the biggest vertical rectangle for the clipboard.
Nice.
Yeah, this geometry is great.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Question about the icon animation.
I don't do animations, but I've seen Lika animating icons in a very good way. And I've seen like icons being animated in apps that I use and everything. I think that mostly when an icon is a loader or when you need to add some sort of a transition, usually when icons are actions, they don't get animated because it adds complexity to something that it's meant to be more subtle. Let's say that you click on an icon, then it only should change its state. If you make it rotate or something, then you're adding like more information that is not needed. But if Lycan's here, what is your take on animating icons, Lycan?
Yeah, like first of all, like you said, the one thing you need to look out for is that you don't make it too complex that you actually create another level of complexity. But the most we are most likely advised to do is to like micro interaction on the icon. For example, let's say a floating action button, whereby you click it is a plus, and when you click it turns to like an X. You get the concept. Just very subtle and very, very simple, not something so drastic that you add an extra layer of confusion for the user. So that is as much as possible what you can do for icon animation. Make it fast, make it easy to understand, and majorly micro interaction, whereby a user clicks and another action happens almost instantaneously. But not that you click, then it rotates, goes drastic and everything.
I feel like we're kind of spoiled nowadays with having so many icon packs available to us, when I kind of remember a time when if you wanted anything outside of like 8 normal icons, you kind of had to build it yourself.
Yeah, that's true. I remember that time too. But at the same time, it's surprising, at least to me, that only just a few of these icon packs are good. Most of them are not technically good, and some of them looked very good. Like yesterday, we were talking about this library, which like at first glance, you'd say, this looks pretty good, right? But then you go to analyze how they're built, and they're not on grid. They are 1.5 pixels stroke. That's never gonna work. Like it's of course, if you have a high density screen, it tends to be much more forgiving in terms of sharpness, like in technical nuances. But at the same time, like they are not being rendered in the best possible way, and that's something that we need to start with, right? It needs to work from the lowest resolution to the highest, and this.
So you're saying like a 1.5 stroke on standard definition would look blurry on your monitor?
Exactly. It needs to be.
Gotcha.
It needs to be 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever you want to use, but nothing in between.
That's interesting. I did not know that.
Did you talk, Matias, also about scaling up like the different levels of detail?
Yep. In this
perfect.
slide, I talk about that, and I can show you like in real time what happens. Like, let's say, and these are scaled up just to show in the presentation, but this should be 16. Wait, I need to activate like the scaling tool and go to 16. And I want to show you what happens if you just, 1 sec, to do some stuff. Well, let's say that you want to use this one in 34 pixels, in 64 pixels or 32 or whatever, right? Then when you scale it up, then it kind of works, but it gets weird because it's not like the details are not meant to be seen at a large scale. So the handle is not proportioned, and why you have only like three lines? Like when you grab this type of objects in real life, they have a scale that has many lines, right? And the way that Nucleo accommodate this is by they add a plate or a base and 1 extra line, and then the handle is more natural. And yeah, it's and as you can see, this is a much better icon, and we can actually go to the same size. So we make it fair, and this should be 2 pixels, and let's say that we make this one 2 pixels too, because it's 4 now, so it's very thick. And as you can see, like this is a much better icon than this, but only because it was designed to work in 64 pixels, and this one is intended to be used in 16 pixels. And the same goes both ways. Like if you go to 16 with this one, and then it's 1 pixel, then it gets very noisy visually. It's heavy. It lacks of visual balance. Like the white space is not good. Is not, as you can see, like the chopped air that we have inside of this triangle. It feels like it's too little, and you get like a stain there. If you squint your eyes, you can see there are parts of the icon that are heavier than others. And it doesn't happen with this one because it is intended to work in 16 pixels.
I have a question for the designers. Would you guys ever design an operating system just as a challenge or professionally?
Like a new design language?
Yeah, let's say like Microsoft or Apple's like, hey, we need you to design a completely new operating system from scratch. Like, would you take on that project?
Well, that's like a really interesting project because there's some elements of design thinking that could be applied and addressed to like a design language. And so thinking about the design language and what you want out of it and like really looking at it from a whole new lens, which is kind of what design thinking is, could really lead you to some interesting conclusions that you might want to try to include if you were going to use those data points and learnings and try and put them back into a language. They could be possible.
So you're all in for it?
110%. Yeah.
And
Just give us 2 years and $1 million.
Nope.
Exactly. That's like
Yeah,
the point.
exactly.
And at the same point, like if you look at the history of operating systems, they kind of look alike because it's rare that unless we change the paradigm that we use to interact with devices, that's going to happen at some point, because this thing of like typing on a device and like interacting with the screen, it's a mess. It doesn't work well. And it's the only thing we have. Like, it's really frustrating. You tap in the wrong places. And like, if you have big fingers, it gets worse. So at some point, this thing is going to change and it's going to be more like conversational UI, or even like, who knows, like something connected to your brain. And maybe that's a point in history where we're going to need to redesign the whole paradigm. And it's not going to be more about these buttons and labels and all of that. But as long as we stick to the current paradigm, then operating systems are going to be pretty much based on the same principles. And as you can see, this is from the 80s, and then you go to nowadays, and nothing has, well, a lot of things changed in terms of like new patterns and the way it looks and feel, but fundamentally it's the same. We still have icons, labels, and menus and screens.